Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is the 40th CALLERLAB convention. We're in Cary, North Carolina. Today is March the 25th, 2013, and the name of this session is A Visit with the Legends. I'm excited about this session. As you know, this session is taped, and in our audience we have legends who have in the past been panelists on this particular session. So I'm excited. I was very excited about being asked to moderate this session. And one of the reasons why is because this is a part of our history and a part of square dance history that I truly believe needs to be told. And so our members of our panel or our panelists this afternoon are Don Beck from Martha's Vineyard, and I stand for Don. We also have Carl Sims from Arlington, Texas. And I want you to hear Carl's story. And, of course, we have Mr. Lee Kopman from the Long Island area of New York. I stand for Lee. And Lilith. Lilith, thank you for being here, too. All right. Very nice. One of the interesting things about a legend is that I was in talking with these three gentlemen. One of them came up with a very interesting definition of a legend. And a legend would be, there are stories about you. Very simply, that's what we talk about when we talk about legends. And that's what we want to hear today, is we want to hear a little bit about stories about each one of these gentlemen. The way that we're going to kind of work this session is we've got about 20 minutes to spend with each one of them, and then we've got a little time for question and answer afterwards. Now, it's possible we could run over a little bit, but I'll try to keep it within about 20 minutes for each of our panelists, and then we'll try to do a question and answer. So be thinking of questions and answerings, or if some of you know of stories that maybe they have omitted and could be brought out, then let's do that, because these stories should be taped and recorded. This session is being recorded. I have a portable mic. I'll come down and we'll make sure that the questions get on the microphone, okay? Don Beck began dancing in 1958. He's been calling since 1964. Before he moved to Martha's Vineyard, he called weekly for the Tech Squares and has been a member of CALLERLAB since 1975. He's been a contributing editor to the New England Square Dance Caller magazine. He's also been one of the authors on the Caller's textbook, which is American Square Dance Society Sets in Order. He was also involved with Choreo Breakdown, and he wrote a book that many of us know is one of the big books in square dancing as far as of methods of choreographic management, and that's his Out of Sight. So let's bring on with a nice hand Mr. Don Beck. Don?
Thank you, Mike. You want to sit down? I got a call from Dana about a month ago, left a message asking me to sit on this panel, and I wanted to know why. And I talked to him, and I said, who are the real legends that you were planning on that couldn't make it? And he told me Al Brundage and Dave Taylor, and they just, due to medical conditions and not responding, et cetera, couldn't. So when I talked to Mike about what's this all about, he possibly coined a term. I don't know. I'd never heard it before, but I feel comfortable with it. Because I was telling Mike, you've called a year more than I have. Why aren't you up there? And he said, well, we're second-generation legends. So I'll accept that. And with that, I thought you were going to moderate and ask me questions. What do you want to know?
Well, one of the interesting things about Don is the fact that he's got a tremendous amount of his influence and mentorship and his calling on the East Coast. And the East Coast, particularly with gentlemen like Jay King. Many people might not know about Jay King and his books and his part of our square dance history and Don's connection with that. So, Don, maybe you can explain a little bit about that.
Let me fill in some of the cracks. I started doing traditional dancing, got dragged into Western dancing, and never really took lessons, just sort of fell into place, mostly first on the West Coast a little when I was in the service, and then at the Square Dance Club at the University of Massachusetts. And after doing just singing calls for 2 years, because I thought you had to be born that way to become a caller and understand hash and that, and it didn't make sense. And then they asked me to take over a teenage club that was folding, and so I forced myself into figuring out how to do hash a little. And I like to think the reason that it succeeded in folding was not because of me, but it was well on the way there before that. Then I got 2 squares in the basement and what have you. And after 5 years of messing around both in the Hartford area and eventually in the Boston area, I decided, you know, it was either time to learn how to call or to give up the whole fun thing I was doing. So I started asking around, and I was dancing with a local club there, and I asked people, well, do you coach callers? Do you do anything? Well, no, but Jim Mayo does. And I didn't know who Jim Mayo was. I'd seen his name in Sets in Order with some of the choreographic things, but I didn't know who he was. So I asked somebody else, and they said, no, I don't know, but Jim Mayo does. And I asked somebody else, and they said, I don't know, but Jim Mayo does. So I got the guts up to call Jim, and he says, yeah, I run schools every once in a while. And in fact, I think I've got enough guys to start one soon. So anyway, that's a slightly different story. I was talking to one of the guys I was working with at Raytheon when I first moved into the Boston area. And he said, oh, I know somebody that's involved in square dancing, and he works at one of our other plants. And a month or so later, he transferred to our plant. His name was Dr. Julius King, better known in square dance history as J. King. And I went up and introduced myself. Jay was a technical writer there, had a PhD in history. I think it was history. And so I introduced myself, chewed his ear a little. And every week I sort of sneak away and spend about an hour with him and distracting him. And something I said to him appeared in his note service, and that went to my head, so I kept telling him more things. But I then asked him about, you know, methods of calling, because nobody had ever taught me that there's reading, memorizing, modules, sight. Sight was very thin at the time, but it was happening. And he said, oh, well, I wrote a book on the subject. Why don't you buy my book? Which was Fundamentals of Calling. And so I bought his book, and I'd read through a chapter or two and said, oh, this is cool. And then I'd go back and say, this is cool. And he'd say, well, read on. And I read some more, and I came up to him and I said, you know, that's not exactly the way I interpreted it, but if it works for you, use it. And we sort of did that all the way up, and so I got a lot of basis from Jay's stuff, as well as interest in the note services and new calls that were coming out, and went to his experimental workshop and danced a few times. He was a really good writer. He wasn't a super performer. If you go to, mostly because he was shy, I think, if you go to some of the really old records on McGregor and such, there are 1 or 2 by J. King, but there are a lot of them by some of the more well-known legends that say choreography by J. King. It wasn't until 1970, I believe, at a caller school in Colorado, talking to people that I finally, you know, I say, well, I use J. King's method. And they say, well, we tried it and it didn't work. And I figured, you know, it went, I guess, you get to a point where it didn't quite make sense, and they interpreted it this way and then quit. And I interpreted it this way, and it kept working. And so it wasn't until years later that.
And I think one of the things about Jay's, I think Jay coined the term burnt image.
I don't know if he did or not. I got that later from elsewhere, but
okay.
Maybe Jack Lassery or so. I'm not sure. Jay in the audience, I hope not. No, Jay unfortunately passed away at the age of 56 or 7 from cancer. It was a real loss to the community. Jay, by the way, was one of the 100 and so people invited to the first CALLERLAB convention. And each of those was supposed to go out and invite 2 more people to let it grow at a controlled area. Jay and one of the other attendees invited me. And I was very impressed at the time. So I haven't been to all of them like a few of the people sitting here have, but I've been to all but the first one. What else do you want to know? That's who J. King was.
Well, but then we're talking about your book, Out of Sight. And the interesting thing about this book was not only in the writing of it, but how you actually came to have someone type it up. And
you know, I finally was convinced that I had carried this approach further than anyone else had. and I wanted to share that with people. And one time Jim Mayo was running one of his caller schools near his home, where he would have somebody come. It came every other week kind of thing, you know. You got a few things to work on, you came the next week to ask questions and move on from there. And he asked me once, I'd been through that, and I was a slight aside, but he started teaching choreography as one of the things he taught, and it was nothing like what I was reading in Jay's book. And I said, but Jay said this. Should I just forget all that and start over with your method? As I said, nobody told me there were different methods. Jim was probably doing modules. And he said, no, learn that too. You know, whatever you can, learn that. And so Jay and myself basically taught me choreography, but Jim taught me everything else there was to know about it: timing, showmanship, phrasing, judgment, et cetera, et cetera. And all those things I didn't even know. Just like any new caller, I thought, if I got choreography, I got it made. And Jim just opened my eyes to the fact that it was a whole interesting field. And when I was done with Jim's school the first time, I told myself, and probably my wife, if I can ever learn to do all the things I know how to do, I'll be a good caller. And it took many years to go through digesting the stuff he did. But anyway, so a few years later, he asked me if I'd come and teach mental image to his school, one of his sessions. And I said, you know, Jim, there's no way I can teach it in one evening. I'd like to teach it, you know, just a small segment one week, and the next week another small segment, and next week another small segment. And he said, well, you know, I can't afford to pay you that much. And I said, that I'll be glad to come and just teach it. I want to see if I can share this and teach it. And a lot of the rules that govern a lot of the stuff that made this thing pretty well work, I came up with because I had to present it to other people. And, you know, the definition of X's and O's, which you don't have to know about, but it was a gut feel kind of thing, and all of a sudden I had to explain it to people. So I sat down and grunted out and came up with some exact rules. So that opportunity to teach it to people helped me develop it quite a bit.
Also, as many of you know, Don wrote Ferris wheel, ping pong, circulate, chain down the line, 3 figures that are prominent figures on our list today. Don, you want to talk a little bit about...
Sure. I was one of these people, probably still am, that we don't need new calls. We got plenty of choreography and variety we can do with the stuff we've got. And I was in the Chicago area on business, driving down some interstate, thinking square dancing like I always did. And I repeated that to myself. We don't need new calls. But if I were to create one, what would it need to be? And I said, well, it's got to flow smoothly. It's got to start in a formation that's used frequently and end in a formation that's used frequently. It's got to have a good name. And I could see this Ferris wheel happen in my head. And that was too good to keep a secret. So I came up with a name called Shuffle and Deal. And when I had a chance, looked in Burleson, I saw, oh, shuffle's been used before. You know, because it's kind of a wheel and deal, but you were shuffling cards and putting one in the other side. Shuffle's been used before. It means this. No, it means this. No, it means... There were about 6 different uses of the word shuffle. And I said, 6, 7, what's the difference? And I showed this to a friend of mine who was a challenge dancer. And he said, where's the shuffle? And I said, which one? And he said, well, only one of those is actually being used at challenge. All right. I wrote this thing up. The way you published calls at the time was you write description, examples, mailed it to all the note services, hoped they loved it and feature it. And I did that, and I got a call from Bill Peters from California, whom I had never met before but was getting his newsletter. And he said, Don, I've noticed that nobody has published that new call that you wrote yet. And I like the way it flows, and I'd like to publish it. But I said, but you don't like the name. He says, yeah, where's the shuffle? And I said, there is none. He said, now, you can leave that name your name if you want. It's your call. Or you can come up with another one. And are you open to suggestions? And I said, sure. And he said, how about Move Ahead? And I said, no, Bill, that doesn't do it. A good name, as Lee will attest to, is part of what makes the call successful. I said, when are you publishing? How long do I need to get a new name? He said, 3 days. So I called Jay King, and I said, you know that new call I sent you? Any ideas on changing the name? He said, well, I haven't really opened the mail in a few days, so I haven't read it yet. I don't know. So I went back into a corner and started grunting, and eventually realized it's sort of like a couple circulate part way and then do your thing. And I decided to call it Circus Wheel. And I said, no, that's not a winner. And I said, well, Ferris Wheel, that's close. And that's where the name came from. It got published. It got used and used and used and used. And unfortunately, that went to my head. All of a sudden, we do need new calls. Triple cast came shortly after that. I understand they still use that at one of the challenge levels. C4. It's going to be C5 pretty soon, which is off the top and not used anymore. But and a bunch of others.
There was something about magnets on or dolls on a refrigerator.
Well, names.
Yes.
Earl Johnston, Al Brundage, and Deuce Williams were planning to start a newsletter, News and Notes, which they eventually did. And Deuce was in town calling, and I went down. I think I'd met him before, and I went down and talked to him and said hi. And he said, Don, got any new calls? And I said, a whole bunch of them, but none of them have any pizzazz to them. And he said, well, tell me the best one. And I told him, and it was terrible. And he said, yeah, I agree, no pizzazz. And he said, well, you know, we're starting this new note service, and I want to be the first. I want to have an exclusive on featuring a call that nobody else has done. And in exchange, I'll give you a free year subscription to the note service. And I, again, said, how many days do I have? And he said, 2. I'm going to be moving out of the area again. So, huh?
At least says there's a call possess.
When you're in a challenge community, you really have to watch what you say because they'll do it. Did you read it, Lee? And I was sitting at my dining room table, well, kitchen table, and I had my magnetic dolls on the refrigerator in a quarter tag formation, which wasn't called that at the time, because that was the current formation that people were using. Fascinate was one of the calls. I can't remember what else was in that vintage. And all of a sudden, I saw this path of circulating around it, and it, you know, was a net in between 2 players or 4 players, and I thought, tennis circulate. And again, that didn't make it, so I called it ping pong circulate. Called Deuce. He liked it. He published it. And I like to say that's the only call I ever wrote on commission, because I got a whole free year subscription on it.
I love it. I love it. Listen, we've got to move on, but I want you to hold questions and think about questions as we move along here, okay? Don, thank you very much. How about a nice hand for Don Beck?
Thank you, guys.
And if this gives you any ideas for discussion later on or questions later on that Don might have skipped over, let's be sure to approach him on that, okay? I'm sure he's okay. The next gentleman, Mr. Carl Sims. Carl, I'm going to give you this microphone. You can sit there if you want to sit.
I don't know why I'm here.
Wait a second, Carl. Before you get going here, I indirectly was exposed to Carl and the legend of Carl Sims from my friends and callers in Japan, Masaru Wada, Takozaki, and what this gentleman meant to them, and how he was such a part of square dancing in Japan in the early years. And as many of you know, square dancing came to Japan in the after World War II and in that area, and how it was able to spread, how so many people were able to become excited about square dancing in Japan, and particularly these 2 gentlemen that I just mentioned. So I was excited to not only hear this story, because I'd heard bits and pieces of it. Also, if you look on the program booklet for the 50th All Japan Square Dance Conventions, Carl's picture appears there in early on there. And so with that said, I'd like to hear it, and I hope you do want to hear Carl's story about how square dancing began. It started out with, at least from the vantage point, that Carl learned to square dance in South Dakota, I believe, right? Rapid City, South Dakota. So, Carl, nice hand for Carl Sims.
Yeah, in 1957, we started square dancing, and our caller, our teacher, I don't even remember his name, but he started out and he taught us the square dance. We square danced for 3 years and then got transferred to Japan, and we joined a square dance club there called Bows and Bells at Yokota Air Base, and we danced there for a few months. And these 3 Japanese people came. They'd come and visit us. Their names were Hayashi-san, Kato-san, and a girl named Miyako. They'd come and visit and then go, and we became acquainted and eventually friends with them. So one day they asked us if we would like to go with them to their folk dance. And we said, sure, we'll go. Well, folk dancing then, folk dancing was part of the Japanese government after the war had, in order for people to have recreation, they had sent representatives or artists to different countries, and they picked up the folk dancing of this particular country, and they'd come back, and then they would incorporate this into their clubs, and they would teach them. And if you've ever done a Russian folk dance, you will have an experience, because you'll get a good workout with it. But so we went there, and then they asked us. We went and visited 3 or 4 times, and they asked us, "Well, would you like to teach a square dance? Because like you do at the base." And we said, "Sure, we'll teach." So we got. They got all the people together. We really didn't do anything. First class we had was 2 sets, I believe. Is that right, Masato-chan? 2 sets. And Masato was in our first class. Him and his wife Yumiko, and they were high school sweethearts then. So we danced in this old run-down schoolhouse out in the country someplace, and we danced, and we had a lot of barriers. First was language, and so we said, well, how are we going to do this? We just can't go in there and teach them square dance. We've got to teach them something else. So we taught them 3 things, and I think even today it's the most important thing in square dancing: style, etiquette, and dress. That's the 3 things we taught them before we ever taught them, or while we were teaching them square dancing. And then the hardest thing, they were learning square dancing was okay, but in the Japanese culture, they have a definite dividing line between instructor or teacher and student, and that barrier was very hard to cross. We like to talk and all this stuff, but the barrier was there when the class was over. They left, and we left, and it took us probably 6 months to break that barrier down, and became friends. Not only friends, but part of the family. It resulted in them being part of a family, and we're still real close. Masato-chan and I, when we first met, neither one of us could speak the same language, but we hit it off. We could talk to each other, and still do to this day. We talk. We can talk about anything, and so getting back to the story, we danced there for one class, and then we moved to Camp Drake. It was a cavalry base that had closed. Half of the base had closed, and there was an abandoned church there they'd left. And at about this same time, Eisenhower was president. As all of you remember Eisenhower. But he wanted started this people-to-people program, and he wanted all of the servicemen or the people Americans in foreign countries to get acquainted and learn the customs and languages of the country they were in. And so it was easy for us to get really what we needed. And it was really easy for us to go down and get this church. It was vacant. I went to see the base commander, and he said, sure. So we spent a couple of 3 weeks cleaning that up, and they turned the electricity on for us, and we went down there, and this place was out of the city of Tokyo a ways. And the kids, they would ride a train for an hour, then they'd have to walk for about a mile, and then we'd have to go down to the gate and sign them in. Then we'd go dance we always danced on Sunday afternoon, and then we would dance. But then we, I don't know, it must have been 6-8 months maybe we danced there. And then I heard about this place just outside of Tokyo was called Green Park, and it was a 3-story building with dependent housing. All over there was housing. They had a school, hospital, housing, everything that the people needed. You could go there and stay in that house for your tour and never leave the country or never leave the building. It was that complete. So went there and talked to them and see if we could use their gymnasium. Sure, you can use it. Just clean it up when you can leave. So we moved there and danced there every Sunday. And when we moved back into that close to civilization, we closed the club. And the reason we closed the club is because we were close to bases, and we did not want our girls used, or we didn't want some 21-year-old GI coming to visit us. And it goes without saying what the reason.
Carl, also at that same time, there was a Far East Scholars Association, was there not?
Right. We right along in, I don't remember exactly one year what it was, but it was about that same time we formed the Far East Scholars Association, and we had a caller on every base around Tokyo had a club, a square dance club, and they were average 3 sets. It was the average size of them. Our average size are the Lucky Eights. We called ourselves the Lucky Eights. Our average dance was 5 squares on a Sunday, and then on once a month we opened the club to everybody, and since we danced on Saturday, we danced on Sunday, all day Saturday, the wife and Masato's wife, girlfriend then, and a couple other girls spent all day Saturday making cupcakes. And we we made the cupcakes, and I bought a 30-gallon coffee pot, and I had an old 1953 DeSoto, blue and white, and I had a Newcomb record player and the big, large speakers and the monitor, the whole bit. and 4 kids and the wife. And so on Sunday, we loaded up. On the first Sunday of the month, we loaded up kids, cupcakes, equipment, wife, and drove the 20 miles to dance. And then we'd come home, and then we danced there until 1965 when I was rotated back. But some of the stories you may want to hear, the funniest story was we went ice skating one time. Took a bus load us up, went to ice skating, and we traveled all night long, got lost, had a flat tire in the bus, got up there, and 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was up in the mountains on a lake, and they had rented a house for us for people to sleep there. And by the time we got up there, the old farmhouse was full of people. I mean, the tatamis were just like this. So they said, just find a place to sleep. Just find a place to lay down. So he went out there, and everybody went. So he kind of scooched in between somebody. He'd never seen them before and never seen them afterwards, you know. But they were warm. So got up, slept a couple hours, and got up for breakfast, and they gave us a bowl of rice, a raw egg, 2 of those little sheets of sushi, and 2 slices of cucumbers to eat with that rice. And that's what we had for breakfast. We got up to the lake, and it was pretty crowded up there, so we said, we don't want to do this. So we scraped off enough for 2 squares to snow off of it, and then we square danced all day on that ice. But it was fun.
Now, you finished up in Japan and then moved back to the U.S.?
I came back to the United States in 1965 and got stationed at Yokota, or not Yokota, Carswell there in Fort Worth. And our oldest boy was in the 8th grade, and the youngest was in the 4th grade, I believe.
Carl, you were there in Japan when Bob Osgood and Bob Van Antwerp came there in 1964. I think that was the first American group that came to Japan.
It was the first American group came, and we got 2 school buses from the base and brought them from their hotel out to the Green Park and danced with them out there. And it was.
I know that had a lot of impact on the Japanese dancers, and it was kind of the start of the exchange between U.S. dancers and dancers in Japan.
I remember 1973 or 74 when the National Convention was in San Antonio. And the first time I'd ever heard John Jones call, incidentally, was there in San Antonio. They chartered an airplane to come in, and the wife and I had quit square dancing because we had, had kids in school and all, how that goes, 4 kids and ball and all their activities, so we really didn't have time. But anyway, we went down there because we heard the kids were coming in, and I still call them kids. We were wandering around there in the convention hall, and somebody came up and said, "You want to go out to the airport? We're going to meet the Japanese coming in." So, yeah, we'll go out. So we got on the bus and went out there, and they formed a line from the door of the airplane in and this was in 1973, so it was 8 years since we'd seen these people. They started coming out of that airplane, and my wife and I were standing off back out of the way, and somebody saw us. That was the end of the orderly exit from that airplane. The next thing I knew, I had a camera over my head. A reporter had his microphone in front of me, and it was a riot, but it was fun.
Amazing. How about a nice hand for Carl Sims? Carl, thank you. Don, you wanted to make a comment?
I just wanted to add that I met Carl yesterday for the first time and spoke with him a little here before the session, and I regret the fact that when he was over there, I visited Tokyo 2 or 3 times in 1962, and I had started dancing already, not calling, and I just wish that I had been able to connect with those guys back then, and you guys too. I missed out on something. Maybe in our next life we'll try it earlier.
Very good, Carl. Thank you very much. You know, our next panelist has had a major impact on square dancing over the years. And I think if you have not seen his book or have not purchased his book, please do so. I did last year, and I did largely because Lilith would sign it for me. And since I've always had a crush on Lilith, I was excited to purchase the book and get her signature on it, as well as Lee's. But it's a great read, and there's a great story. So without further ado, Lee started dancing
long time ago.
I think in 1957.
Yeah, I started. I was a phys ed major, and I taught in Bethpage, Long Island. I wanted to be a principal at one time, and part of the requirements of a phys ed teacher be the first 2 years we take all the courses that the pre-med students take. Then after that we get into the phys ed curriculum, where we start to do basketball, football, and all that. And one of the courses was a course in rhythm and dance, and we had to do square dancing, square and folk dancing. And the caller that we had teaching the square dancing was a fellow by the name of Bob Weschler, and I loved it right away. And there was a 4th grade teacher that was putting on an assembly, and she asked me if I would call a square dance for the students, because they had learned it during the gym class, because she was putting on an assembly. And I said, yes, I'd love to do it. Well, I called for them, and the parents came, and one of the parents, after the assembly, her church was putting on a caller, on a square dance. And she asked me if I was available to call a square dance for her church. Of course, I said, yes, absolutely. And I had never called before. So my principal permitted me to take the equipment out. I went out there. I took 2 pairs of underpants because I never thought I would make it. So I went to the church, and I only knew 6 square dances. At that time, it was Eastern dancing. Red River Valley, Duck for the Oysters, climbing up the Golden Stairs. And, come on, Jerry, help me out. You know all those dances. And I knew 6 dances, and it went over great. And, of course, there was somebody there whose church needed a caller. And before you know it, I was calling for all the churches on Long Island. It worked out great. And there was there was a callers association that I joined, and then all of a sudden I saw some of the dancers doing a square through and a slide through, and I had never seen those things before. And there was a group that was doing some basement dancing to tapes, or records. There were no tapes at that time. Dick Jones tapes and Max Forsythe's tapes. And I really liked what I saw. And I started to pick up on that. And I started to learn how to do it. Lilith hated that dancing. I think she hated it not so much for the dancing itself, but she didn't like the people that was doing the dancing. There was a caller on Long Island by the name of Paul Hunt, who was calling that kind of dancing. And he would call it, and he would call it fast. There was no such thing as the kind of dancing we do now, with the levels advanced and so on and so forth. And challenge and the mainstream of the Plus program, but then after a while she started to get interested, and I started to write calls. By the way, do you know what the most important call in square dancing is right now? Anybody have any idea? Well, look, you're out of this. Do you know? I told you, you're out of it too. Anybody know?
Square your set.
Oh, get out of here. Anybody have any idea? Roll. Because roll can be applied to hundreds of steps. Yeah, basic. Well, roll is not on, I think roll is on it comes on the plus list, right? I wrote roll as an add-on call to right and left roll, which is pretty hard to do, by the way, for new dancers to learn. Because when they do a right and left through, they want to hold on to their partner. But when you do a right and left through and you add the roll to it, you got to drop hands and roll individually. But roll is one call that you can add on to lots of calls. Okay, I just want to add that to you as one of the calls I wrote, but whatever the case. And before you know it, I started to call on Long Island. I went to Dick Jones's dances. Oh, I just loved the way he called. He was absolutely sensational. And he used to sing, God bless him, he was absolutely outstanding. And he used to call to tons of dancers on Long Island. Then after a while, you know, I had some time off. I had lots of time off. But I started to call on a Friday night, and I used to get a couple of squares. And I would pick up sets in order, and because I didn't understand choreography at that time. And if I want to do some choreography, I would rip out the page, go to the dance, read the choreography, and call those steps. If anybody came up to me and asked me, what did you mean, I was dead, because I didn't understand what was going on. So I went to some caller schools. I went to Al Brundage and Earl Johnson's. I went to those schools. I came back. I still didn't know what the heck was going on. The only way you're able to learn how to do choreography and call it is to put your checkers down, study it, and then you'll know how to become a caller. Because learning how to do choreography and do your calling, it's, I'll give you an example. If you want to learn a foreign language, you learn the language, and then you say to yourself, well, what does this mean in English? When you can think in the language, then you know how to speak the language. It's the same thing in choreography. When you're comfortable with doing those calls and you can think the calls themselves and not say, now, what do you mean by a right and left through? Or what do you mean by a square through? And you can do it right away, then you're a caller. Until you can do that and think within the calls themselves, then you're a caller. That's what it means. When you think in terms of side calling, and you can say, if you're in lines of 4 and you pass through and you wheel and deal, where is 2 in relation to 1, without thinking about it, then you know how to side call. If you can square, if I say to people at a caller school, and I say to them, if you square through 2 and you do a right and left through, who you're looking at, and you can tell me immediately, then you're a caller. Then you're thinking visually in your mind, where are you and what's going on? And that's what you do at caller school, okay? And that's what I teach when we caller school. You know, people are calling recycles now. Do you know anything about recycles? No. Well, recycle was written as an all-8 recycle. That's how I wrote the call. I'll tell you how I named it in a minute. An all-8 recycle is the heads past the ocean, okay? You're in a quarter tag. Is there anybody that doesn't know what a quarter tag position is? Okay. An all-8 recycle was written where you have a quarter tag position, and the couple in the middle does a recycle around the outside, and the side couples come in and do a facing recycle. Now, if you don't know how to do a facing recycle, you're out of luck. Unless you teach your dancers how to do that. And it puts the side couples in the middle in a recycle position. Now, how I wrote that call, I was driving to school, and I saw a truck it was a garbage truck, and it said, all-8 recycle. Naming calls was the funnest thing to do in my house. I wrote a call once that said, truck. And Steve said to me, what the hell kind of a name is truck? What are you, crazy? Well, you can't call a challenge dance without using the name truck. If you don't know what truck means, if you're a boy and I say boy's truck, he slides to the left. If you're a girl and I say girl's truck, you slide out to the right. Girls are always right. Lilith, be quiet. In other words, if I say the heads slide through and the head's truck, the boy slides out left and the girl slides out right. That's a truck. If you want to say in your own terminology, if you don't dance advanced, dancing, and if you say the heads slide through and spread, that's a truck. But when you say spread, the other ones automatically come in. But if you're a challenge dancer and you say the head's truck, you got what they call an O formation. Not important, forget what I just said. If you're just dancing, not just, I shouldn't say that. If you call mainstream or plus, forget what I just said. But, the dancing at the different levels is very interesting. It really is. You can get a call at a higher level that's easier to dance at a mainstream or a plus level. And they're good. They're really good. Outstanding calls, really good. And if you start to get some of these magazines that we have now, the what's it called, the Challenge magazine, sets the zip code.
Zip code.
That some of the calls it's been taken over by a new group from South Carolina. We're introducing some new calls into that magazine that are outstanding, and they're at a higher level. You can probably implement them into your groups if you call them Mainstream or Plus. We have a new call out now called Top It Off. That's absolutely outstanding, and they're introducing it probably at the Plus level, and it may be a Plus call. Absolutely outstanding. I have a call that my wife is not crazy about called Bring Us Together, and she doesn't even get excited about it. How many people call heads lead to the right and circle to a line of 4? How many here call it? Raise your hands if you call that. All right, put your hands down now. Heads lead out to the right and circle to a line of 4. 13 words to get them out there. Now, isn't that crazy? Heads bring us together. 4 words sounds much better. Get you into a line of 4, and it's absolutely beautiful. You know the call? Stand up. Trace, you know the call? Stand up. You know the call? Who else knows the call? Get up. I didn't tell you. Stand up as heads. You got a decent partner out there? Jerry, get your wife out here. Okay. You know the call? I'll get over here. Yeah, get a lady. Get somebody who's decent. Debbie, get over here. All right. All right, we need a little bit of room here, okay? All right. Here's the heads bring us together, and it equals the heads lead out to the right and circle to a line of 4. Now listen to what I said. Heads bring us together. How many words? 4. Talk to me. 4. Don't get excited. All right, the head couples, listen to me. Circle half. Drop hands and slide away from each other, and don't slide to your left. Don't veer, just slide out to your left, and don't be nervous. I'm on your side. All right, now go back to where you were. Now you're the head couples, right? All right, circle half. Drop hands and slide away. You got that much? Now go back to where you were. Now while they're doing that, the side couples face to the right in single file. Not yet, don't move. While they're doing that, the side couples are going to promenade single file, past them, and face in. You got it? Go. There's your line of 4. Heads bring us together. Now, isn't that better than heads lead out to the right and circle to a line of 4? Let's try that again so they can see it. And if you don't try this in your next, okay? Now, the name of the call is Heads Bring Us Together, where they circle half, slide out, while the other single file promenade around them and face in. Go. Heads bring us together. And there's the call. It equals heads lead out to the right, circle to a line of 4. There are other variations, but you got to go to CALLERLAB next year to find out what's going on. All right, you can sit down. I've had some interesting experiences growing up in this activity. Okay, they're in the book. You don't have to buy it, but you should. I remember when I was calling at the National Square Dance Convention once, somebody called me up and said, would you please call here? And I said, you know, I think it was in Kansas City. I said, I really can't go there because, you know, when you get out there, you call 20 minutes, and it's really not worth it to go. He said, what do we have to do to get you out here? I said, well, give me a half hour or an hour, introduction in the Plus Hall, introduction to A1 or A2 in the Plus Hall, and I'll come out there. So he says, I'll call you tomorrow. So he calls me tomorrow. He was the chairman of the assignment committee. He calls me tomorrow. He says, we got it. I said, what'd you get? He says, we got your introduction to advance in the Plus Hall Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. I said, I'll be there. It was really a winner. All right, I get out there on Thursday. He picks me up in a hearse. He was an undertaker. Not only did he pick me up in his hearse, he had a customer in the back. I almost died. All right, I'm finished. It's been a great activity for me, I have to tell you. I love it. I've been calling since 57. If I had it to do all over, and she's been a big part of my activity. She's great. Okay, that's it for me.
Very good, Lee. Thank you very much. Lee, one other gentleman in your past, Paul Hunt.
Oh, Paul Hunt was stupendous. Yeah, stupendous. And I got a son who's outstanding. Stephen is great.
That must have been fun having the interaction with, I mean, it's one thing when you're thinking of things yourself, but having someone else to bounce things off. I mean, yeah. For him to be able to look at you and say, what is truck, you know?
I used to be better than he, but he not only caught up now, he's getting to the finish line faster than I am. Yeah.
Wait a second. Well, yeah. Stand up and come on up here because we're going to talk. No.
We had a beginner class in the basement. He was 5 years old. And if we were missing a person, we would wake him up and bring him downstairs, and he would dance. He was born dancing when he was in kindergarten. He called a square dance for the class, and the kindergarten teacher nearly died. He called at the World's Fair when he was 5. I mean, he'd been calling forever. But they had a thing. Dinner table conversation was, if I do blah, 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 how do I get a left element in 2 squared, 2 words, 2 whatever. That was what dinner was like, always. Our daughter and I, we didn't know that kind of stuff. Nobody could talk choreography with me. But he and his son, and the other thing I think that he didn't tell you was, Paul Hunt was the other caller who was quite good on Long Island. Now, Dick Jones was a singer, and Lee Kopman is not a singer.
Thanks a lot.
That's not his long suit. But Paul Hunt would prefer the academic part of it more than Dick Jones. Now, that's not to say he didn't swoon from how great Dick Jones called, but to follow in that path would have not been the right way. And Lee called all his life the way he likes to dance. That's what he does. He calls what he would like to do. So.
Excuse me, but I had 2 singing calls that were record of the month not too long ago.
Very good, Lilith.
I told you
I've always had a crush
she was cute.
How I've always had a crush on Lilith. It's amazing. Hey, questions. Anybody have questions? Yes. I'll bring the mic down.
I've noticed that whenever you guys write the calls, it's while you're driving. And I was wondering, what time are you leaving on Wednesday?
Yes, John.
I'm John Jones, and I know one story that the first time I went to Japan to call and got ready to call the dance, the caller of the club came up and told me, we danced the mainstream program plus aso. Lee wrote aso just for Japan. And do you all still dance aso? Yeah. Whatever program, you got to include aso in it.
One of the things about, when a challenge caller takes a call like aso, we would put him in a grand ocean wave, give you an example. And we would say the very end 2 of that wave only, aso, while the others explode, touch a quarter, you're in a column. So those are the little things that the challenge callers like to do to take these calls apart. I didn't do Wahoo. No.
Barry Clasper, and I've known Lee for a long time. And we know that Lee has written a lot of calls. I mean, that's one of the things he's famous for. But I don't think many people really appreciate the magnitude of the impact that he's had on our community. Lee retired from the ACE convention, 2 years ago, was it, Lee? And so we had kind of a celebration of his retirement from the convention. And as part of that, we did some research and we put together a list of all the calls that were on the lists that we use at the ACE convention, which is advanced through C4, and we put together all the calls that Lee had written that were on those lists. And actually, we also included the mainstream and plus lists. And what was really interesting was I think you had, there was two calls in the mainstream list, 3 calls in the plus list. There was about 25, these numbers are approximate, I don't remember the exact numbers. There was about 25% to a third of the calls on the advanced list that Lee wrote. Roughly half of the calls on the C1 list. The C2 list, he fell down a little bit. He only had about 25 or 30% of them. 3A, he had about 60% of the C3A list. And I forget what 3B was, but it was a big number too. Plus, there's all kinds of C4 calls that Lee has written that are still in common use. So the impact this man has had on our activity is just phenomenal. We really have taken it for granted almost that all these calls exist and so many of them belong to Lee. And I'd just like to thank him in this public forum for the contribution he's made to our activity.
Wait. New Year's Eve in Japan?
Yeah.
New Year's
Why don't
Eve
you
in
tell 'em?
Japan,
You tell 'em, Mo.
1976.
Yeah.
My brother had a men's store. and Lee went to get a shirt from my brother's store because we were going to Japan and he wanted something new and fresh and wonderful. Well, my brother said, go out the back door. Now, you know that white tag that you have on when you buy shirts in a department store? You can't get it off for anything. Well, he's calling, it was an afternoon and evening dance, 1976. It was the year, it was the big bicentennial, yes. And he was changing into this shirt. And this shirt had the white tag on it, and he couldn't get it off. And he was kicking it and stepping on it and banging it and doing all kinds of things so that he would wear his nice new shirt. But he had
It's a good thing I bought an extra shirt to put on.
He always
This
does.
was New Year's Eve, don't ask.
He always does.
Oh, there's all kinds of things that we can tell that were just fun to do. It's been great.
Yeah, John, here we go.
I debated about telling this story, but since Lee and Lilith are both here, I'm going to tell it anyway. We had met a couple of times, but we never had called together or done anything together. We were just acquaintances. And the first time we called together was at the Delaware Valley Festival in Philadelphia. And it was about 8 or 10 callers on the program, and we were going from hall to hall about as fast as we could go. So Lee was calling in one of the halls, and I was to follow him the following hour. So I went in there to see what he was going to do so I wouldn't do the same thing, which I knew I couldn't anyway. And he saw me in the hall, and he came over and he said, would you like to share this hour with me? And I said, but it's your hour. I've got the next hour. And he said, well, I've got the next hour off. He said, let's share 2 hours together. So I said, okay. And I went up on the stage, and Lilith was sitting at the back of the stage crocheting or whatever you were doing at the time. And I knew he knew a whole lot more choreography than I could ever dream up. And in my stone face, I looked at him and I said, Lee, you screw me around, and I'll kick your ass off of the stage. And Lilith said, get him, John. And I said, I will. I'll get even one way or another. He said, I won't do you that way. We had 2 beautiful hours of calling and choreography. And it got to a point, he would set the dancers up, and I would get them out. I would set them up, and he would get them out. We did all kinds of things in that 2 hours that I never dreamed that I would be able to do with Lee. And it was so funny that we would do something that would be really different from what the norm was without giving it a name, and some of his dancers would come up and say, what's the name of that combination? And I said, it's called square dancing. And I was in one of the halls calling, and I called something, And exactly half of the floor was able to do it, and the other half broke down. And I said, oh, my God. Well, this half that broke down started moving around. And I said, no, that's not a call. Lee has not written that one yet. And so we had a real good time. But I just wanted to let you know that he's a good guy to work with.
Very good. Very good. One story here.
As Mike said in his introduction originally, a legend is somebody that you tell stories about. And one of the stories I tell about an interaction I had with Lee was early days of CALLERLAB plus committee. Lee was the head of it, and he had the whole committee sitting on the panel up at the dais with him. There was the center, Lee, myself, people that we're all legends except as one secondary legend here. And the guy that introduced Lee was saying, you know, you're typical, here's a man that needs no introduction, but he's the guy that wrote Recycle, Anything and Roll, Coordinate, wasn't Relay the Deucey, was it? No, and on and on and on. And Lee turns to me and he said, yeah, but I didn't write Ferris wheel, you bastard.
Marcel Water from Tokyo. I'm sorry, I cannot speak English not smoothly. Translate Mr. Takozaki. 私は、スクエアダンスをカオル・シムさんに、教えていただいて52年が経ちました。
This is Takozaki, Tokyo again, but you know, I just learned my English through square dancing. Masaru just wanted me to be, you know, a interpreter for him. He said it took 52 years when he started the square dancing.
Mr. Carl Sims からはその初めてスクエアダンスの楽しさ、それからスクエアダンス音楽の新しさ、スクエアダンスコスチュームの珍しさ、そして、周りのアメリカの方々とのその交流の楽しさというものを教わりました。
He learned through Carl Sims how the square dance is enjoyable, how square dance is, you know, beautiful, like a costume and things, kind of things, and also how wonderful the friendship with American square dancers. So this is what he learned through Carl Sims.
そして我々がこの楽しいスクエアダンスを日本に広げていこうという時にリー・コップマンさんが日本に来日をしました。
So he just wanted to expand and popularize this, you know, such a wonderful square dancing all over Japan. This kind of period, Mr. Lee Kopman just visited Japan.
そしてスクエアダンスのコレオグラフィーの楽しさ、複雑さ、そしていろいろなベーシックムーブメントを彼が紹介をしたということで、日本のスクエアダンスというのはますます盛んになってきました。
He really helped to introduce how that choreography, you know, should be important, and how that square dance call is, you know, complicated, and also on the other hand, it's very enjoyable. So these kind of things just, you know, are scattered around all over Japan, and Japanese square dance, you know, activities just increased very much.
現在日本にはスクエアダンスを楽しむ人たちが1万5000人ぐらい全国に、日本全国に1万5000人ぐらいいます。
There are square dancers right here in Japan, 15,000 square dancers right now.
これの裏付けになったのはカオ・セイムス、そしてリー・コッパンのおかげだと感謝します。
The reason why we had 15,000 square dancers, you know, here in Japan right now, always, we owe really very much to Mr. Lee Kopman and Mr. Carl Sims.
Arigato.
Thank you.
TAC was in my third class that we taught after we formed the club. And the first words he ever said to me, he walked up and he says, "I am TAC Ozaki." That was the first words he ever said. And he's been my son ever since.
Oh, after all, that's one that we need to.
Yeah, we were on the
Phil Donahue show.
Yeah, I was playing racquetball, and as I came home, opened up the car door. My wife was at the door. She said, "We got a call from Pat. What was her name?
Pat something.
Pat something." And she said, "They want you on the Phil Donahue show." I said, "Come on." She said, "Yes, you got to be on the." So I got on the phone. I called her, and she said, "We want you to come on the Phil Donahue show." This is really one of the most exciting things that we've ever had with us. And I said, "Well, that's wonderful." She said, "We would like you to be on the show." I said, "Good. We would like you to be on. When would you like us to be on?" She says, "In about 2 weeks." I says, "Are you serious?" "I'm serious." So we got dancers from Detroit, we got them from Ohio, we got them from the Chicago area, and we got them from New York. And we went up there. Something funny happened on that day. We were supposed to fly up there because Dave Taylor was one of the callers that we were going to have in one of the squares. So, and there was supposed to be a storm, and we were supposed to fly up later that day. And if I couldn't make it, Taylor was going to do the calling on that day. And no way was going to fly up late that day. And Lilith was at school. I said, "Come home right now. We're changing our flight plans. We're going up now." So we got up there, and we met Phil Donahue. He just wanted to speak to me. And he was all dressed in a Western outfit. And he said, "If anybody asks you any questions, answer them. Don't take a long time." And he went around, and we had one group, African-American group. That's what he wanted, which was really good. And he spoke to everybody in the square, and he asked questions of everybody. And then when he finished talking to everybody in all the squares, he said, "Now here is Lee Kopman. Is he from Mississippi? Is he from Arkansas?" He said, "He's from," and I said, "the Bronx, New York." And it was absolutely stupendous. One of the highlights of our career, right, Lil? That was really good.
I just wanted to add that the square dance world was excited that we were going to get that kind of exposure when Lee was on. Yeah, we were nervous with Lee doing it.
Thanks a lot. You think you were nervous?
I was working as an engineer at the time, and I had this cool little TV that had a 3-inch screen. And I had it set down on the floor next to me, so while I was working at my desk where my boss couldn't see, I kept looking down at it. We didn't have TiVos and that kind of thing at the time. And, man, did he represent us well and his group. It was really worth a good thing.
One more time, and then we'll kind of close them off.
Pam Clasper, just very quickly. The book is available through DSL Productions, and they also have DVDs of the Phil Donahue Show available for sale.
This one here. Yeah, right here.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's
great.
Lilith?
Has all the calls we've ever written. Really cute stories in here too. If you're interested in it.
You know, he's not a singer. We know that, even though he had 2 records.
Thanks, Lilith.
That's not his long suit. Anyway. They asked Pat McMillan. First of all, when she called me and said, "This is Pat McMillan," I said, "Come on." She said, No, this really is. This is the producer of the Donahue Show. I said, "Would you please tell me the truth?" She said, "My word of honor. This is Pat McMillan, and we want Lee on the show because a dancer had written to them and said, I would like to see on the Donahue Show our favorite activity done by our favorite caller on our favorite TV show." And that's how he got on. But he had to send them the records that he was going to use. And she picked the songs that she wanted him to do. He couldn't just do anything. And he also did it with a live band.
Yeah, there was a live band on there, too.
Right. And they
Don't
did
ask
some
how I felt
traditional
about
stuff.
that.
And he said to Lee, he was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt.
That was Phil Donahue, yeah.
Right. And Phil Donahue said, "Oh, I'm embarrassed. I feel like I'm underdressed." No, I said, it's okay. It's all right. Because everybody made these beautiful square dance clothes. It was really one of the most exciting things in our lives,
That's right.
really. And they wrote letters to CALLERLAB. And his former students, Lee used to teach elementary school, phys ed. And former students wrote got in touch with him and said, "We saw you on TV." They were just thrilled. It was thrilling.
Really was a highlight as far as television. And, yeah. How about a nice hand for Don Beck, Carl Sims, Lee Kopman. Thank you guys for attending this afternoon. Visit with the Legends. There's books up in here. Help yourself. Thank you, and have a great rest of the convention.